What would you do if you suddenly lost everything and had no one left by your side? What would be your next move? This question might make you stop and think for a moment. And that's exactly what happened on that fateful day. Keanu Reeves, the man with the calm demeanor and a heart of gold, had no idea that his life would take a turn that would leave everyone around him shattered. His last moments would leave an imprint on the heart of a little girl and on anyone who hears this story. But before we dive into the intense details, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the rest of this gripping tale. It was just an ordinary afternoon, or so they thought. Keanu was walking down a quiet street. The sun was setting and Emily, a sweet 10-year-old girl, was by his side, chatting away about her day at school. Emily adored Keanu. To her, he wasn't just a protector, he was a friend, someone who had been there for her when no one else was. Keanu, a man who had experienced heartache and loss, found peace in helping others. He'd become a father figure to Emily after her own parents had tragically passed away, and their bond had grown over the years. They were just a few blocks from Emily's home when it all happened. A group of men, masked and armed, appeared from nowhere, cornering them in an alley. Keanu barely had time to react as one of the gunmen shouted at them to stay still. Everything moved in slow motion. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But Emily was terrified, her wide eyes filled with fear, and Keanu knew there was no time to waste. Before he could fully comprehend the danger they were in, the first shot rang out. It was meant for them, an unprovoked attack, part of a twisted game of violence. The bullet hit Keanu, and the shock of it sent him reeling, but he didn't falter. His only thought was to get Emily to safety. The pain coursed through his body as he pushed Emily behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. Blood began to stain his clothes, but Keanu, gritting his teeth, refused to let go. He wasn't about to let this girl, who had become like family to him, face danger alone. He staggered forward, his legs weak but determined. He had to protect her. The sound of more gunshots filled the air as he urged Emily to keep moving. But in that moment, time seemed to freeze. Keanu, the hero, was no longer the untouchable action star everyone believed him to be. He was human, vulnerable, and yet he still found the strength to fight for the person he loved like his own. What happens next will leave you breathless. Can Keanu escape this situation? And what will his final words be? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. You don't want to miss what happens next. This story is just getting started. Keanu Reeves had always been the kind of man who lived with his heart on his sleeve. To many, he was just a famous actor, known for his roles in action films. But beyond the glitz and glamour, Keanu had a much deeper, quieter story, one shaped by loss, resilience, and an undying belief in doing what's right. Growing up, Keanu had never been handed anything easily. He came from humble beginnings in Toronto, Canada, where his family faced their own share of hardships. His father had left when he was young, and his mother had to raise him and his sister on her own. Keanu knew what it was like to struggle, and he developed a fierce determination to never let his circumstances define who he was. But it wasn't just the external struggles that shaped Keanu. He had endured immense personal loss. When he was in his early 20s, Keanu's younger sister, Kim, was diagnosed with leukemia. The battle was long and heart-wrenching, and despite all their efforts, Kim passed away. This event changed him forever. Keanu withdrew from the world for a time, unable to cope with the grief. He could never forget the feeling of helplessness and the crushing weight of losing someone he loved so deeply. But through the pain, something profound happened. Keanu found a new sense of purpose. Instead of letting the tragedy consume him, he decided to devote himself to helping others. He started focusing on charity work, anonymously donating millions of dollars to cancer research and supporting children in need. He found peace in knowing that his actions, even if unseen, could make a difference in someone's life. As he became more involved in his charity work, Keanu realized something. He didn't just want to be an actor known for his films. He wanted to be known as someone who gave, who cared deeply for others, and who would do whatever it took to make the world a better place. His fame could be used for something bigger than himself. That's how Keanu found himself in the position he was in that fateful afternoon, protecting Emily. She wasn't just a little girl to him, she was like family. Her parents had died in a tragic car accident when Emily was just 7, and Keanu had stepped into their place as a protector. Emily had struggled with the loss of her parents, and Keanu, understanding grief like few others, had been there for her. He was the one who showed up at her school events, who spent weekends teaching her how to ride a bike, and who shared stories of his own childhood with her. He saw in Emily a spark of hope, of life, and he became her guardian angel, even though she didn't fully realize it at the time. Their bond grew over the years. To Emily, Keanu was more than just the man who saved her from loneliness. He was the one who made her feel like she mattered, even in the darkest times. He gave her the strength to smile again, to laugh again, to dream again. And in turn, Emily's pure heart reminded Keanu of the importance of every small act of kindness in this world. In Emily, Keanu saw the future, bright, untarnished, and full of potential. Their world was simple yet filled with meaning. Keanu's life was no longer just about himself. It was about making sure Emily and others like her could live a life full of hope. Every moment with her was a gift, one that Keanu cherished deeply. But now, as he stood in that alley protecting Emily with his life, Keanu couldn't help but think about everything that had led him to this moment. He had faced unimaginable grief. But in this very moment, he had a chance to protect what mattered most. No fame, no fortune could ever compare to the preciousness of this one life, the life of a child who still had so much to give. He didn't have a family of his own, but Emily was as close as it got. She was everything. And so, as the shots rang out around them, Keanu Reeves wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the future, for the promise of a life that would go on, even if he couldn't be a part of it. But the battle was far from over, and the path ahead would take them both into unimaginable danger. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens next in this heart-stopping journey. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is just around the corner, and you won't believe how it all unfolds. Keanu Reeves's world had been flipped upside down in a matter of seconds. Blood began to seep through his shirt, and the pain from the bullet wound made it harder to breathe. But even though his body was failing him, his mind remained sharp. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. Emily was still with him, and he needed to get her out of this mess. The alley, once quiet and peaceful, had transformed into a war zone. The gunmen were closing in, their voices muffled by the noise of their movements and the shouts of chaos. Keanu's pulse thudded in his ears as he staggered forward, pushing Emily ahead of him, trying to shield her from the danger. He could hear Emily's frantic breaths behind him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. "Stay close." "Emily," Keanu whispered hoarsely, forcing his legs to move even as they trembled under his weight. "We're almost there." The street they had been walking down was just ahead. If they could make it out of this alley and into the main road, they might be able to find help. But the gunmen weren't about to let them escape so easily. One of them, a tall man with a menacing sneer, raised his weapon and took aim. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The bullet from earlier had left him vulnerable, but there was no time to feel sorry for himself. If he didn't act now, Emily would be in even more danger. Instinct took over. Without thinking, Keanu lunged forward, knocking Emily behind a dumpster for cover. His body hit the pavement with a sickening thud, but he didn't feel the pain. Not yet. He'd pushed everything aside for the moment. "Get down!" Keanu shouted as he tried to shield Emily with his own body. The gunshots rang out again. One bullet grazed his shoulder, and another missed him by inches. It was clear they were aiming for him now, using him as a target to get to Emily. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They weren't just trying to scare them, they wanted them dead. "Come on, Keanu, get up!" Emily's voice trembled, her words barely audible over the sounds of the gunfire. She was trying to crawl out from behind the dumpster, desperate to help, but Keanu shook his head, his hand reaching out to stop her. "Stay hidden," he managed to croak, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "Don't come out until I say it's safe." The cold sweat on Keanu's forehead mixed with the blood soaking his shirt. His mind was foggy, his vision starting to blur. But he refused to give up. Not now. Not when Emily was depending on him. One of the gunmen advanced, his footsteps echoing ominously as he neared their hiding spot. Keanu reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the gun he had concealed there. His grip was shaky, but he tightened it, drawing strength from his sheer determination to protect Emily. "Come out, you coward," the gunman shouted, his voice dripping with malice. "You're not going to get away." Keanu's heart pounded as he took a deep breath. He was running out of time. The gunman was only a few feet away now, and his chances of making it out alive were slim. But if he could buy Emily just a few more seconds, she might have a chance. He slowly lifted his gun, aiming at the approaching figure. His fingers trembled as he steadied himself. The man was still coming closer. Keanu's thoughts flashed to his life, his struggles, his losses, and the unspoken promise he'd made to Emily. He couldn't let her down now. "Not today," Keanu whispered to himself. He fired. The bullet hit the gunman in the leg, sending him stumbling backward, cursing in pain. But the fight wasn't over. The other two gunmen quickly took cover and returned fire. Keanu barely managed to dodge the incoming shots, but he had done what he set out to do. He had bought Emily the time she needed to escape. "Run, Emily!" he shouted, even though he was barely able to speak. "Run!" Emily hesitated, her wide eyes filled with terror as she saw Keanu struggling, but she didn't need to be told twice. With one last glance at him, she bolted toward the street, her small body darting out of the alley and into the chaos of the main road. Keanu watched her go, his heart in his throat. He had done everything he could to protect her, but as she disappeared into the distance, he knew he was running out of time. He collapsed against the cold brick wall, his vision narrowing as the blood loss began to overwhelm him. The sound of the gunman's approach was getting louder, but all he could think of was Emily. He had kept his promise to her, and that's what mattered. The pain in his chest intensified as his breathing grew shallow, but just as his world began to fade to black, Keanu's thoughts were consumed by one final question. Would Emily be safe? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what comes next. This is only the beginning of Keanu's incredible journey, and what happens next will take you completely by surprise. Keanu's vision swam in and out of focus. The cold brick wall that he had collapsed against seemed to be the only thing grounding him, but even that was slipping away. His pulse was weak, and the world around him was becoming muffled, distant. The sounds of gunfire had faded, but the one thought that kept him tethered to reality was Emily. She was safe for now. She had escaped. That was all that mattered. The moments after Emily fled were a blur. Keanu could feel his body shutting down. His breaths were ragged, shallow, each one more difficult than the last. He could feel the wetness of his blood spreading across his chest, and with every beat of his heart, it seemed like the life was draining from him. But his mind kept circling back to Emily. Was she really safe? She had made it out of the alley, but where was she going? Was she heading to the police, or was she lost and scared? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. A shadow loomed over him, blocking what little light there was left. Keanu barely had the strength to lift his head, but his instincts told him that whoever was walking toward him wasn't one of the gunmen. Keanu, hold on." It was a familiar voice, one he hadn't heard in what seemed like ages. A rush of relief flooded through him, though it barely registered in his half-conscious state. The figure knelt beside him, gentle hands pressing against his wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "You're gonna be okay, just stay with me." Keanu blinked, his vision struggling to clear. The voice, was it really her? "Sarah," he rasped, his throat dry and cracked. How did you—" "I've been tracking you, Sarah," a close friend and former colleague replied, her voice thick with emotion. She had known Keanu for years, having worked with him on several charity projects. She had always admired his selflessness, but now, as she saw him lying on the ground, pale and weak, her heart ached. "You're tough, Keanu, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. You're going to bleed out if I don't get you help." Sarah's hands worked quickly, trying to stop the bleeding as best as she could. Keanu could feel his body growing heavier, but somehow hearing Sarah's voice gave him a sense of peace. She was here. He wasn't alone. I couldn't—" Keanu's voice faltered, his words barely escaping his lips. "Emily." She's safe, right? You have to find her." Sarah's eyes softened, and for a moment Keanu thought he saw a flicker of fear in them. "I'm not leaving without you, Keanu. You have to stay awake, okay? Help's on the way. You just need to hold on for a little longer." But Keanu knew better than that. He could feel the pull of unconsciousness, the weight of it dragging him down. He had been in enough close calls to know that this wasn't just a scrape. This was serious. The blood loss was too much. His chances were slim, and yet all he could think about was Emily. Had she made it to safety? She was just a child, lost in a chaotic world that was too big and too dangerous for her. He couldn't bear the thought of her alone, especially after everything they had been through together. If he was going to make it through, he needed to know she was okay. I need to know Emily's okay," Keanu whispered, struggling to keep his eyes open. "I'll find her," Sarah promised. "I swear to you. But you need to focus on breathing. Focus on me. Please." Keanu tried to nod, but it felt like his head was made of stone. The world was starting to slip away from him, the edges darkening. His body felt weightless, as though it were no longer his own. "I promised her," Keanu muttered, his voice barely audible. "I promised I'd protect her." "You did," Sarah replied, her tone firm but soft. "And you will. Just hang on." But Keanu couldn't fight it anymore. The darkness closed in, and despite Sarah's words, despite his desire to stay awake, he lost consciousness, sinking into a void of nothingness. The journey Keanu had started wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, as he lay unconscious, the battle was no longer just his to fight. The next chapter of this story would belong to those who still had the strength to carry on, to Sarah, to Emily, and to anyone else who refused to give up. Keanu Reeves lay motionless, his body still and cold, as Sarah's desperate attempts to stop the bleeding seemed to be in vain. The sound of distant sirens could be heard growing louder, but for Keanu, time was slipping away. His life had been a series of choices that led him to this moment, this very alley, this exact spot where his life might end. Yet despite all of it, his thoughts weren't of himself. They were of Emily. Had she made it? Was she safe? The hope of protecting her, the girl who had come to mean everything to him, was the last thing he held on to. Meanwhile, far away from the alley, Emily was running. Her legs were aching, her breath ragged, but she refused to stop. The adrenaline from the chaos still surged through her veins, and the fear of what had just happened fueled her every step. She had run from the alley, not knowing where to go, but knowing one thing: she couldn't go back. Not yet. Emily had been in a state of shock ever since the gunshots rang out. The image of Keanu, wounded, collapsing to the ground, was burned into her memory. But her survival instincts kicked in, and despite the overwhelming terror, she kept moving. The main road was full of people, yet no one seemed to notice the terrified little girl running in their midst, eyes wide and filled with panic. Emily spotted a payphone on the corner and bolted toward it, her small hands trembling as she fumbled for change. The world around her seemed unreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Every noise felt like it was closing in on her. Her fingers were slick with sweat, but somehow she managed to dial Sarah's number. The phone rang and rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the line clicked, and Sarah's voice came through, strained but familiar. "Sarah." "It's me, Emily," she gasped, trying to keep her voice steady despite the overwhelming fear. "Keanu, he's hurt. I don't know where he is, but they shot him. He protected me, Sarah." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she listened, her eyes flicking to Keanu's still form beside her. She'd been trying to keep him alive, but hearing Emily's frantic voice was like a slap of cold water to the face. The girl was alone. She had nowhere else to go, and Sarah had to act. "Emily, stay where you are. I'm coming to get you," Sarah said quickly, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was racing. She glanced at Keanu's pale face and made a snap decision. She had to get both of them out of there. With one hand holding Keanu's wound as best as she could, Sarah reached for her phone and called for backup. The moment was slipping away. Keanu was losing blood fast, and Emily needed her. Every second counted. As Sarah began to organize help, Emily made her way down the street, not fully understanding where she was going, but knowing she couldn't stay in one place. She kept running, her feet barely hitting the ground. Her mind raced with questions. Would Keanu be okay? What was going to happen to her now? Was she alone? The world she knew was shattering, and she wasn't sure how to piece it back together. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice from behind her. "Hey, you there, wait a second!" Emily froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned around, her breath caught in her throat as she saw a familiar face emerge from the crowd. It was one of the gunmen from earlier, the tall man who had chased them through the alley. His menacing grin was enough to send Emily into a full panic. "Don't run, little girl. You're not getting away that easily," he sneered. Fear surged through her, and for a moment, all of the lessons Keanu had taught her about standing strong in the face of danger seemed to evaporate. She was just a child. How could she possibly escape this? But then something changed. She remembered the promise Keanu had made her. He promised to protect me, and he had. He had sacrificed himself to save her. Emily wasn't going to let him down. Her small hands clenched into fists. With everything in her, she took off again, running faster than ever before, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, but she refused to look back. The alley where Keanu had been shot was still fresh in her mind, and she couldn't let herself think of the danger that might still be out there. Just as the man reached for her, she spotted an opening between two buildings, a narrow gap that would be hard for anyone else to fit through, but not for her. Emily darted into the alley, squeezing herself through the gap. She could hear the man's angry shouts, but she didn't stop. Her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving. Back in the alley, Sarah's phone rang again. It was Emily. "Emily, where are you? Are you safe?" Sarah asked urgently, pacing back and forth. I'm okay, but I don't know where to go," Emily cried, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. They're after me. Keanu—" Sarah's heart broke at the sound of Emily's voice, but she knew what had to be done. "We're coming for you, Emily. Just hold on." Keanu's final moments were approaching, but little did he know, his sacrifice had already started the chain of events that would lead to a greater mission. The journey of survival was no longer just his. Now it was about protecting Emily at all costs. The darkness that had enveloped Keanu seemed endless. He could no longer feel the cold pavement beneath him, nor the urgency of Sarah's hands pressing against his wound. His thoughts drifted between hazy memories, glimpses of his past, of his mother, of Emily's laughter. But through the haze, one thought kept rising to the surface. Had he kept his promise? Keanu's mind raced back to the night he met Emily. She had been just a girl, lost in a world she didn't understand, and he had promised to be there for her. To protect her. Now, as his body betrayed him, he had no idea if he'd succeeded. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but it paled in comparison to the thought of failing her. Somehow, though, in that darkness, he heard a voice. A soft, familiar voice, like a whisper across time. Keanu. It was Emily. The memory of her calling his name echoed in his mind. The echo filled him with both fear and hope. He couldn't leave her alone. Not now. Not ever. The sound of sirens grew louder. Sarah had gotten help, and the backup was arriving. But Keanu wasn't sure if he could hang on long enough to see it through. He could barely keep his eyes open, but in his heart he knew that the story wasn't over. Not yet. Emily had run as fast as her small legs could carry her, her breath coming in short bursts, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She couldn't stop, not until she knew Keanu was going to be okay. But as the sounds of footsteps behind her faded, she started to question if she had made the right choice. She had just barely escaped the gunman. But where was she going now? And just as those thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, she heard the faint hum of an engine in the distance. The faint glow of headlights pierced the darkness, and a car pulled up beside her. Sarah stepped out from behind the wheel, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Emily, get in the car, quick!" Sarah called urgently, her voice trembling. Without thinking, Emily ran to the car and jumped in, the door slamming shut behind her. She was safe, for now. "Where's Keanu?" Emily gasped as she slid into the seat, her voice shaking. "He's hurt, Emily." "He's been shot," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with pain. "But I'm doing everything I can to get him help. We just need to get to a hospital." The urgency in Sarah's voice was clear, but Emily wasn't sure if she could bear hearing more. Keanu had always been her protector, and now, as she sat in the passenger seat, she felt like she was the one who needed protecting. The car sped down the empty streets, but the silence between them was heavy. Emily stared out the window, the dim streetlights casting fleeting shadows on her face. Every corner she turned, every street sign she passed, she couldn't shake the image of Keanu lying in the alley, barely clinging to life, and deep down she wondered, had she made it in time? Had she gotten away soon enough? Back in the alley, Keanu's condition was deteriorating by the minute. The rush of voices and footsteps had finally reached his ears, but he was barely conscious. Sarah's face swam in front of him, her features blurred by blood loss and fading consciousness. "Keanu, you've got to hold on for just a little longer," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Stay with me, please." His eyelids fluttered, the weight of his body sinking deeper into the cold ground. The pressure of the gunshot wound had left him struggling to breathe, but he forced his mind to remain sharp. For Emily. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he just mouthed the words, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "I'm sorry." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of an approaching ambulance reached them. It was a sound he hadn't realized he was waiting for, but in the back of his mind, he felt a surge of relief. They were going to help him. Maybe not now, but later. As the ambulance doors swung open and paramedics rushed to him, the dim light of the alley suddenly felt like a beacon. The world seemed to slow down, and Keanu's pain dulled for just a second. He had lived a life that had been full of sacrifices, of unspoken promises, but now, with his life hanging by a thread, he finally realized that it wasn't the end that mattered. It was the journey. And in his journey, he had given everything for the ones he loved, for Emily. Later that night, Keanu lay in the hospital bed, his body covered in bandages, hooked up to machines. The doctors had done everything they could, but his condition was still critical. He had made it through the worst, but the question remained. Would he recover fully? Would he be the same person? The uncertainty loomed over him, heavy and oppressive. His eyelids flickered open, and the first thing he saw was Sarah standing beside his bed, her face etched with worry. "Keanu," she whispered, relief flooding her voice when she saw his eyes open. "You're going to make it." Keanu's eyes shifted to the empty chair beside his bed. It was a small gesture, but the absence of Emily was palpable. Where was she? Sarah sighed softly, understanding the unspoken question. "She's at the hospital with family. She's safe now." The weight of those words hit Keanu like a ton of bricks. Emily was safe. That was all he had wanted. The rest, his life, his future, was secondary. The room was silent for a few moments, the only sound the beeping of the machines. Then Keanu lifted his hand, his voice hoarse but determined. "She's stronger than she looks," he murmured. "She'll be okay. You have to promise me that." "I promise," Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes as she held his hand. "But Keanu, you're stronger than you think." Keanu closed his eyes once more, the events of that night playing out in his mind. Emily had made it, and as he drifted off into a deep, healing sleep, he felt the weight of his journey lifting, knowing he had done what he set out to do. His final words, perhaps, were not a farewell. They were a promise that love, hope, and sacrifice would always carry the ones we cherish to safety, even in the darkest moments. As the days passed, Keanu's recovery remained slow but steady. The doctors had been amazed by his resilience. Despite the severity of the gunshot wound, his body was fighting back. But even as the machines beeped in rhythm and the sterile hospital room felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, Keanu knew his real battle wasn't physical. It was emotional, and that battle wasn't over. His mind wandered constantly to Emily. After the chaos had died down, after the fear had settled, he realized the enormity of the responsibility he had taken on when he first promised to protect her. And now, even though he had made it through, She was still out there, struggling to navigate a world that had been turned upside down. Keanu's days were filled with quiet reflection. He had survived, yes. But Emily, what would she be facing? Now, the world they lived in wasn't easy for someone her age. The trauma of what they had both witnessed would linger for years to come, shaping her, affecting her in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. He tried to stay strong for her. In his thoughts, he imagined her smiling, going to school, growing up as she deserved to. But in his heart, Keanu knew that she had been scarred in ways she hadn't even realized yet. One evening, Sarah visited him, as she did every day, bringing news about Emily. She was recovering, but the little girl still carried the weight of the past few days. "She's holding up," Sarah told Keanu, sitting at the edge of his bed. "She's tough, just like you, but she's struggling with everything that's happened. The trauma's hit her harder than I expected." Keanu's hand clenched into a fist. He wanted to do more. He wanted to be there for her, not just as the man who had protected her in that one moment, but as a mentor, a figure she could rely on for the rest of her life. He couldn't be her savior forever, but he could show her how to live, how to rise above the darkness they had both been thrust into. "She's not alone," Keanu said softly, "and neither am I." Sarah gave him a soft, knowing smile. "No, you're not. You've got a lot of people behind you, Keanu, and Emily. She knows she's not alone. She's going to be okay." Keanu nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for Sarah's words. He knew that his fight wasn't over, but there was hope. There was always hope. That night, as Keanu lay in his bed, a thought lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about him, anymore, or even Emily. It was about the people who had been with him through this journey, the ones who had fought with him, who had stood by his side when the world seemed like it was falling apart. And now, Keanu had a new mission: to be there for the people who needed him, to guide them, to help them heal. He had survived, yes, but the true test was what came next. It was the choice to live fully, to keep moving forward, and to never stop fighting for the ones who mattered. That was what kept him going now. The knowledge that he could still make a difference, that his survival was more than just a stroke of luck. Emily's next visit to the hospital was different. She didn't come as the scared little girl who had fled the alley. She came as someone who had faced her fear and survived. She stepped into the room with a small but resolute smile, her eyes tired but filled with an unspoken understanding. Keanu looked at her, feeling the weight of their shared experience. He could see it in her eyes, the same strength that had been in him all along, even if she didn't know it yet. "You're okay," he said, his voice rough, but filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in days. "You're gonna be all right." Emily nodded, sitting down beside him. "I know, Keanu, you're gonna be okay too." Her words filled him with a quiet joy. They had both survived. They had both made it through something that most people couldn't even imagine. And now they would heal together, in their own time. As the room filled with the quiet sounds of healing and the soft hum of the machines, Keanu realized that the battle wasn't over. Life wasn't going to hand them an easy path. They would still face challenges more than they could foresee, but now they had each other, and that made all the difference. "Now, we want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in Keanu's shoes? If you had to make a choice between protecting someone and letting them fend for themselves, how far would you go? Let us know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this coming your way. Stay tuned for more moments of hope, sacrifice, and resilience. Keanu's recovery wasn't easy. Each day was a struggle, not just physically, but emotionally. There were nights when the pain was unbearable, when the weight of the trauma from the attack threatened to pull him back into darkness. But every morning, he woke up determined to keep moving forward. He knew that life had a way of throwing obstacles at you, but it also gave you the chance to rise again, stronger than before. The hospital room, once a place of intense fear and uncertainty, had now become a symbol of endurance. Every day Sarah came to visit, sometimes with Emily, sometimes alone, but always with the same encouragement. Sarah had become a true friend during this time. Her support was unwavering, and it gave Keanu the strength to push through. On one particular morning, as Keanu sat in the hospital bed staring out the window, his thoughts drifted to the life he had before this, before everything had changed. He remembered his quiet life, the ordinary moments, the small joys. He had been just another person in a vast, often indifferent world. But now everything felt different. His purpose had expanded, and he realized that life was no longer just about surviving. It was about using the second chance he had been given to make a difference. The past few weeks had made it clear that he had been blessed with more than just survival. He had a purpose, and he had a duty to use it for good. Just then, the door to his room opened, and Emily walked in, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Her eyes were still a little red, but there was a sense of resolve in her that Keanu had never seen before. She wasn't the scared little girl who had run for her life anymore. She was growing stronger, and it filled Keanu with pride. "Hey, Keanu," Emily said, her voice a little shaky but firm. "I brought you some flowers. I thought it might make the room feel less hospitally." Keanu chuckled softly, the sound of his laughter surprising even himself. "Thanks, Emily." "You're right, it definitely helps." She sat down beside him, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "Sarah says you're doing better every day. I'm glad," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were thinking something deeper. "I'm getting there," Keanu replied, looking at her with a softness that only a few months ago he wouldn't have been able to show. The world had changed him in ways he hadn't fully understood until this moment. Emily paused, her small hands clasped together in her lap. "You know, when you were hurt, I was so scared. I didn't know what I'd do without you, but I know now that I can keep going because I'm stronger than I thought. You made me believe that." Keanu's heart tightened. She was right. It wasn't just about him protecting her anymore. She had learned in the most difficult way possible how to protect herself. It was a beautiful, painful thing to witness. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've always had strength. I just helped you. See it." Later that week, Keanu was finally discharged from the hospital. His body was still healing, but he had made enough progress to begin living his life again. As he stood in front of the hospital, breathing in the cool air, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. There were still scars, physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. But Keanu understood now that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about growth. It was about finding peace with the parts of you that hurt the most. Sarah was waiting for him outside, her car parked just across the lot. She smiled as she saw him approaching, her face a mixture of relief and joy. "Keanu, you made it," Sarah said, pulling him into a hug. "You really did. I wouldn't have made it without you, Sarah," Keanu replied, his voice sincere. "Thank you for being here, for everything." They stood there for a moment, just holding each other. There was so much unsaid between them, but the bond they had forged during these challenging times was stronger than words could ever express. As they pulled away, Keanu looked over at Emily, who was standing by the car, watching him with a shy smile. She was still young, but there was an undeniable strength in her eyes now. She wasn't the girl who had been thrust into an adult world before her time. She was becoming her own person, resilient, brave, and capable. "Are you ready for the next chapter?" Keanu asked, his voice light as he walked toward her. Emily nodded. "Yeah, I think I am, and I know that I can handle whatever comes next. I have people who believe in me." Keanu smiled at her. He was proud of the person she was becoming, and he knew that she was going to be okay. No matter what, she would carry the lessons from their shared experiences into her life. As Keanu and Sarah drove off, heading toward a new chapter in their lives, Keanu couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shown him something incredibly important. That even in the darkest moments, hope could be found. That love could drive you to do the impossible. And most importantly, that no matter how many times life knocked you down, you could always get back up. Now it's your turn. If you could choose a moment to change your life, what would it be? How would you face your toughest challenges? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed Keanu's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got more powerful stories to share with you. Thank you for being part of this incredible experience. The months that followed were a time of quiet, healing for Keanu, Emily, and everyone who had been a part of their incredible journey. The world, as it often does, moved on. The news cycle had moved past the tragedy, the headlines had shifted, and the city slowly returned to its regular rhythm. But for Keanu, the events of that fateful day were never far from his thoughts. He had a new sense of purpose, one that went beyond the physical scars or even the emotional weight of the trauma. Keanu knew that the true test of a person wasn't in how they survived, but in how they lived after the storm had passed. Keanu had spent the last few months working closely with local youth organizations, sharing his story and giving back to the community. Emily had been by his side, though, in her own way. While Keanu spoke to groups and worked on rebuilding trust in the neighborhood, Emily had found her own outlet. She had started volunteering at the community center, helping younger kids who had been through similar struggles. She was becoming someone Keanu could be proud of, someone who, in her own way, was becoming a source of strength to others. She wasn't just the little girl he had protected. She was now a powerful force in her own right, showing others how to heal and how to move forward. One warm summer evening, Keanu sat on a park bench near the community center, the place where so much had changed for him. He watched as Emily ran around with a group of younger kids, teaching them how to play basketball. Her laughter rang through the air, and for a moment Keanu allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He remembered the days when he thought he would never see happiness again, when he wondered if he would ever be able to move past the trauma of that day. But now, watching Emily, seeing how far she had come, he realized that the road to healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the past and using it to shape a brighter future. Keanu stood up from the bench, stretching his legs. He walked over to Emily, who was wiping sweat from her brow as she ran around teaching the younger kids. When she saw him, she smiled, her face glowing with pride. "Hey, Coach Keanu," she called out, using the title she had affectionately given him in the months that followed. "Want to join in?" Keanu laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm not sure if my knees can handle that anymore. You've got this under control, Emily." She grinned and patted the empty space beside her. "Come on, just one game. You know you can't resist." Keanu hesitated for a moment, then gave in, sitting down beside her on the court's edge. He watched the kids play, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. "This place, and it feels different now," Keanu said quietly. Emily nodded, her eyes focused on the group of kids. "Yeah, it's like we're all growing together. I know we've both been through some tough stuff, but we're making it, and that's what matters." Keanu looked at her, feeling the depth of her words. This wasn't just a young girl speaking, it was someone who had learned the hardest lessons life had to offer and was ready to pass them on. "Yeah," Keanu said, his voice thick with emotion, "it does feel different." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the playground, Keanu sat in silence for a moment, watching the children. He thought about the man he had been before everything had changed, the man who would never have understood the depth of love, sacrifice, and growth that he now knew to be true. The bullet that had nearly taken his life had also, paradoxically, given him a new lease on it. He had learned that the greatest acts of bravery weren't the ones you read about in the headlines or saw in movies. They were the quiet, everyday choices to be better, to love more, to forgive, and to grow. Keanu turned to Emily. "You've taught me a lot, you know that?" She raised an eyebrow, her hands on her hips as she looked at him. "What, like how to shoot a basketball?" Keanu chuckled. "Maybe not that, but you've shown me what it really means to live." Later that night, after the kids had gone home and the park was quiet again, Keanu and Emily stood at the edge of the basketball court, looking at the stars overhead. "You're going to do great things, Emily," Keanu said softly. "How you've already started." Emily smiled and took a deep breath. "I know I'll keep going, and so will you. I think we're both on the right path." Keanu felt a surge of pride in his chest, not just for her, but for both of them. They had been through hell, but they were still standing. And more than that, they were thriving. Keanu's final lesson had been a simple one. Life wasn't about surviving the worst moments. It was about using those moments to shape the person you were meant to be. It wasn't about holding on to the past, but finding strength in it to move forward. And most importantly, it was about recognizing the beauty of each day, of each second, no matter how difficult the road. As Keanu watched Emily walk away, her silhouette framed by the streetlights, he knew that his journey wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Now it's your turn. What lessons have you learned from your struggles? How do you turn the hardest moments of your life into something that propels you forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've been inspired by Keanu and Emily's story, be sure to hit that subscribe button. There's always more to come, always more to share. Thank you for being part of this journey. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. We can't wait to hear your stories and keep sharing powerful moments together. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep moving forward.